welcome to this very special show of the firm. We come to you from the location of the International Bar Association's Business Law Conference, which is a gathering of some of the finest minds in the legal profession, many of whom have joined me on this panel tonight. So I said it promises to be a very special show of the firm. Let me start by introducing my guests who span various geographies and various sector expertises. I'll start with Hendrik Haag of Hengele Müller, and then we have Dilhan Pillai of Wong Partnership. We have Adam Emmerich of Wachter Lipton Rosen and Katz. We have George Golding of Slaughter and May, Barney Reynolds of Shearman Sterling, Mr. Cyril Schroff, who's been on the show before, of Amarchand Mangaldas, and Bharat Vasani, who's also been on the show before, Group General Counsel of the Tata Group. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being on the firm. It's a pleasure to have you on, and I'm going to start with you, Barney Reynolds. What seems to be completely unavoidable is the fact that the entire financial system across the globe is going to go through an overhaul. We're going to look at different capital market regulations. We're definitely going to look at stricter regulations for the banking and the financial product industry. What do you expect to see, and do you think that as a reaction to everything that's happened right from 2007, we may cross the line of overregulation?
I certainly agree there's going to be regulatory reform. I think it's inevitable. This crisis could have been prevented by better regulation. Having said that, I think the fundamentals of the current regulatory structure are sound. So my personal hope is that there won't be a reaction that involves completely tearing things up and starting again, and it doesn't look as if that's happening. There needs to be an international response, however, to stop prevent one of the features of the current crisis recurring, which has been regulatory arbitrage. And I think there'll be 5 different types of regulatory reform that we'll see. First, in relation to disclosure, senior risk managers at some of the main banks say that they can't actually, looking at their rivals' balance sheets, work out what their positions are. And that's clearly unacceptable. The disclosure regime, we can't whittle back on disclosure. We need to expand the disclosure regime so that it's more effective internationally, and that will involve looking, I think, further at the role of credit rating agencies and also the perimeter of regulation, and bringing into regulation people whose positions are currently somewhat opaque, and that includes offshore funds, hedge funds and private equity funds. The second category is sort of prudential regulation of financial institutions' management, how they operate. I think there will be much more attention paid to the sorts of people that run the institutions, and there will also be more attention paid to the compensation structures to stop perverse incentives taking hold and actually running away from the management. Thirdly, I think there will be much greater sophistication in the regulatory capital regime to take better account of the various risks that institutions are running, which under the current system are still somewhat crudely covered. For instance, in relation to what's called operational risk, it needs to be broken down and dealt with in a far more sophisticated way to cover legal documentation, management and other types of risk. Fourth, I think there's going to be systemic regulation, or whatever one likes to call it, i.e. some sort of oversight of the system as a whole to make sure that we don't again have a situation where bubbles can emerge without anyone actually pricking them at the appropriate moment. Quite how one deflates bubbles when they're emerging, I think is going to be a very difficult question to address, but nevertheless I think it's clear there will be systemic regulation, and that probably will be conducted by central banks as well as by regulators. And then finally, I think that the cross-border issues between regulators, institutions doing business around the world, where at the moment the recipient, the country where the business is done, the regulators there aren't allowed to question the position of the institution. They have to defer to the regulator of the state in which it's incorporated. I think that's going to be re-examined. Because we've had extreme cases of institutions which don't do very much in the state in which they're established, doing a huge amount of business in someone else's state and causing problems which the receiving state can't do anything about because they have no jurisdiction effectively over the levers of regulation for that institution.
Okay, would anyone like to add to that? Is there any additional regulation that you're likely to see outside of what Barney pointed out, or can I get to the next question?
Well, I think that this covers all the areas that are likely to be looked at. Whether this is going to be a global solution, I think the jury is still out about this, because right now we are rather seeing the tendency that each country is trying to protect its own financial industry at the expense of the others. But I think in the center of the financial crisis, and that's also the center of the new regulation, are the so-called toxic assets. Why are they toxic? I think for the first time the financial industry has created an instrument where it is totally impossible to trace it back to real assets. They have become so intransparent, triple repackaged CDOs, for example, that the only absolute indicator of value was the rating. And if you lose the trust in the rating, the price becomes absolute and arbitrary. We don't actually know what the losses are, but because the assets are toxic, it's like you have a poisoned baby food, and in one glass you can't sell the 5,000 others. No one knows about it. And that is, I think, in the center of the future regulation, because the negative effect, this impossibility of determining value of the paper, has this
When you say center of future regulation, do you mean that to some extent innovative products, if I may call what you've described as innovative, will no longer be welcome for the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years till human memory wipes out what happened in 2007 and 8, or at least the memory fades to some extent? Or do you think that different kinds of product will replace what we now call toxic assets?
I think the transparency issue is really a key issue in the further discussion, together with the role of the rating agencies. Will the rating agencies continue to have the role which they had in relation to these products up to now? Will different transparency requirements be imposed that make it in the sense that it must be possible to trace the value of a security back to a real asset, or the other way around, will you penalize the banks for holding intransparent products by just putting extra capital charges on them?
All right. So
one thing that might be worth adding is, perhaps in a contrarian vein, when Hendrik talks about this, at least I hear that the problem effectively has already been solved, because, as you put it, the problem is effectively one of rampant animal spirits. And so people bought these products understanding they weren't transparent, but relying upon the rating. That won't happen, at least for some considerable period of time. So when we talk about regulatory responses, which is something that lawyers tend to think of, one could propose that the problem has already been solved, that it's working its way through the system, but that regulatory reform is not what's necessary to prevent people from, at least for some period of time, as you said, in the future, purchasing things they don't understand because someone else tells them it's good. Everyone felt good for a while. No one will feel good about this kind of transaction for some period of time to come.
all right. George, you wanted to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say that presumably the most difficult aspect of what you're talking about is the fifth category, the international cooperation. And I can see that being very difficult. Our Chancellor Gordon Brown talks about this all the time, but I can see that being very, very difficult to implement.
Within Europe, I think it's achievable. We already have a structure of home, host, state regulation, which I outlined, which doesn't quite work, but nevertheless, with some small adjustments, I think it's capable of being made to work. And I don't think it requires, incidentally, a single European regulator to make it effective, in the sense that you need regulators on the ground where the business is done, not someone speaking a different language in another country on the phone, regulating from afar. But internationally, outside Europe, particularly across the Atlantic, I agree it's a key question, and if there can be agreement between Europe and America, we can solve this. If there cannot be, it's going to be much more incrementalist, and we're going to have to rely on self-policing by the people.
But are we making a case for a sort of supra-regulator? I think, as Mr. Schroff has also spoken about it in previous conversations, a sort of pan-countries, pan-market regulator. Is that even possible? Adam? George?
Well, it's going to be difficult for one reason, and that is, and we've heard this today, the sort of old world, new world kind of discussion where, not without justification, a lot of people look at the USA and the UK and criticize us for what we did or failed to do. And I can see that making this process very difficult.
Okay. Dylan, I wanted to come to you for one point, and I think, already raised in the earlier comments by Barney, is fund oversight. And I think this worries a lot of people here in India, because we've been very dependent on hedge fund money, private equity fund money, and there seems to be the sense that they are now going to come under the purview of regulation, whether they like it or not. What kind of regulation do you think that the hedge fund industry, or sovereign wealth fund industry for that matter, is going to have to see, and what kind of impact will that have on global credit flows?
Well, I think if you look at the hedge fund industry, I think most people would argue that you would need some form of regulation. You can't believe that a particular sector that has such a massive impact on capital flows and investment decisions could actually remain unregulated
for
totally.
so long. Absolutely.
The question is the form of regulation. Are you going to regulate them by licensing them, using a fit and proper test as to who should be employed and whether they are competent enough to do their jobs? Are you going to regulate all the activities?
Are you also going to regulate how much leverage they can sort of take on?
Exactly. Yeah. Are you going to do that? In Singapore, we tend to regulate almost everything, except we've decided not to regulate hedge funds, and that's for competitive reasons. We regulate even stock brokerages by requiring capital set aside for the risk that they take, but we've decided not to do it for the hedge funds because if we did that, business will go to Hong Kong. So at the end of the day, the regulatory arbitrage that Barney brought up is a big significant issue in the context of hedge funds.
Even in the case of the US and Europe,
yes,
it's the first example I've seen of even the US shying away from regulation for fear of losing a business. Normally they go ahead and things happen, but in this particular context they've effectively done very little.
Okay, let me get a point in from Mr. Shroff and Mr. Vasani. What do you think some of this conversation that we're having here may not pertain to India because we haven't seen the sophisticated kind of toxic assets in this country? We've really not had that kind of wipeout in the banking system. But some of it will have repercussions on the Indian capital markets and the regulatory system here as well.
Absolutely. I think the Indian context has got a couple of variations. And as you heard from some of the speeches today, firstly, we believe that the problem didn't start here. It started outside. And we are actually the victims of some of this rippling through the system and flowing into India. So my guess is that the Indian regulators will first watch what's happening in the West and then tropicalize it and adapt it to ourselves. I doubt very much whether we are going to get ahead of the world and start regulating some of this before the West does. In terms of the regulatory scale, we are already at the more conservative point compared to a lot of other markets in the world. So the incremental action that we need to take immediately is probably less. We just need to wait and watch and see how the world reacts. But some common themes like regulation of hedge funds, these probably have a standalone sort of position of their own. And we might see some movement over there. Or, for instance, regulation of our mutual funds, which is a model that is increasingly...
Which Mr. Bhave has also been talking about. Yes, I think that there needs to be a lot more scrutiny.
And very broadly, in terms of the difference between OTC products and exchange-traded products, the entire OTC regime is coming into disrepute now. And so we're going to probably see at least more, to start with more disclosure, and then moving on to probably more rigorous regimes.
Mr. Vasani, would you like to come in with a quick comment?
Well, I agree with Cyril. The only thing is that I believe that the Indian government would not immediately react. The Indian regulators, primarily SEBI and RBI, may fine-tune or tweak the regulations here and there.
Right.
But I don't expect any whole host of new regulations coming in at this stage.
Okay.
Because I don't think that the problem is as acutely felt here as it is in the West.
All right. So we've gotten through one issue. We have two more to go, which is M&A and protectionism. They're interlinked in some sense. At this point, I'll take a quick commercial break. We'll come back to our panel of experts in just a bit.